Friends, some words of Torah for Parshat Bereishis. Adam and Eve were not the first human beings to walk this earth. Both according to tradition and according to the very chronicles that we read in the Parshiot of Bereishis and Noach, Adam was created 5,785 years ago. The rabbis observe that the reason why the Torah lists the 10 generations between Adam and Noah, and the 10 generations between Noah and Avraham by name, is to show the chronology from creation until the giving of the Torah. Once upon a time, it would have been possible to believe that the very first intelligent Homo sapiens were Adam and Eve, just under 6,000 years ago. But modern archaeology, such as the discovery of Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey, just above Syria, shows that not only were there intelligent humans long before then, there was an entire settlement of intelligent hunter-gatherers dating back to at least 8,000 before the Common Era, over 10,000 years ago. This is long before our counting of Adam's creation, less than 6,000 years ago. How do we reconcile the archaeological data with the biblical timeline? Let's carefully examine how the Torah describes Adam. The Torah teaches that God made man in his image. What does that actually mean? Don't we know that God has no physical form? The Rambam undertook this question in the very first chapter of his Guide to the Perplexed. Properly defining God's image was very important to him because he was an ardent opponent of any kind of corporeal attributions to the completely transcendent God. As in most chapters of the first section of the Guide, the Rambam deals with biblical language to help explain Jewish concepts. He notes that the normal Hebrew word for image is the word toar in Hebrew, but that word isn't at all used to describe how Adam was made in God's image. He concludes that God's image has absolutely nothing to do with physical appearance. Instead, the Torah uses two different Hebrew words to describe Adam's creation. When first deciding to make man, Hashem said, Na'aseh Adam b'tzalmenu kidmutenu. Let us make man in our form, our tselem, and in our likeness, demut. The Torah then details how God actually created man b'tzalmo, in his form, without mentioning the second word demut. Later, in introducing Adam's offspring in chapter 5 of Genesis, the Torah says that this is the book of chronicles of the generations of Adam on the day bidmut Elokim asa oto. On that day, God made Adam in his demut, without mentioning the first word, tselem. Why are two different words used, and why use one in one verse and the other word in the other verse? Adam and Eve were not the first humans, but they were the first human beings that possessed both tselem and demut of God. We look at the medieval commentaries in the aggregate and note that there are two distinctive features about this first Adam. Firstly, he is the first creature capable of understanding transcendence, both within himself and in God. Pre-Adam man did not yet understand that existence could transcend the physical. Adam was able to appreciate the idea of existence unbounded by physical matter. This is what is meant by God saying that Adam was created in God's tselem. Adam is the first person to have some level of divine intellect, capable of seeing the world with some vantage point that resembles God's. He can grasp the concept of a transcendent God, and that a portion of that God is contained within man in the form of his transcendent soul. Secondly, Adam is the first human being with free will to choose between good and evil. The reason why this is called demut is because man is domeh, is more similar to God than God's other creations of intellect, namely the angels. Whereas the angels are of a higher order of creation because they're completely non-physical, they nonetheless lack the challenge and ability to choose freely. Humans are only similar to God, though, since God's free will is nothing like man's free will. We can now better understand why in one verse the Torah underscores Adam's creation as being b'tzalmo, in God's tselem, whereas the other underscores his creation in God's demut. When the Torah describes man's initial creation, God charges man to pru urvu, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and conquer it, and subjugate all other living creatures. Why does God deem man to be deserving of being at the top of the food chain? It's because he is able to recognize Hashem in this world. Once the servant recognizes his master, the master feels free to give the servant added responsibilities and the power to dominate his other subjects. That is why here the term tselem is used to describe Adam's capacity to see and feel God within creation. By contrast, Genesis chapter 5, which lists all of Adam's descendants, has a completely different purpose and teaching. Here the Torah is chronicling how man devolves from the most perfect of all human beings, Adam, into the depraved and lustful human of the generation of the flood. It is only because man was created with free will, and that progressively over 10 generations that free will ran amok, that man found himself in a state of complete self-destructive immorality. That is why the Torah introduces the Chronicles in chapter 5 with the phrase bidemut Elokim. God granted Adam free will, which explains how he ended up the way he did. There's a Talmudic teaching which delineates a dispute between Rabbi Akiva and Ben Azai as to the most important verse in the entire Torah. We know Rabbi Akiva's verse, Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. But for Ben Azai, it is a verse that describes how man was created in God's image. What's curious is that instead of citing the first verse from Genesis chapter 1 that uses the word selem, Ben Azai chooses the verse from chapter 5 where Adam is created in God's demut. Now that we understand that demut implies free will and is very different from the intellectual recognition of the word selem, Ben Azai's teaching takes on a whole new meaning. The reason why this verse is so important is because it reminds every person that he or she was endowed with free will to make the right decisions in life, both for interpersonal choices and choices vis-a-vis serving God. Finally, there are two verses where both tselem and demut are used. Chapter 1 says that God said, "Let us make man bitzalmenu kidmutenu." Notice that the order is first tselem and then demut. But in Genesis chapter 5, when describing the birth of Adam's offspring Seth, it says that Adam gave birth to Seth bidmuto kitsalmo. First, the word demut, and then secondly, the word selem. So why is the order reversed? We submit that this is the foundational difference between God creating a human being from scratch, as in Genesis chapter 1, versus Adam spawning a human being from himself in chapter 5. The moral lesson of chapter 1 is God created Adam with the primary objective for him to recognize God in the world. The fact that he has the freedom to choose whether or not to fulfill that objective is secondary to the function that was assigned to him. But the Torah's moral lesson in chapter 5 is completely different. To the extent that we can intentionally pass anything on to our children, it is the demut, the inclination to choose good and virtue over evil, that we must first cultivate within ourselves. We don't have to worry about selem because that's mostly automatic, but the demut, when we want to be able to pass on our moral virtue and avoid passing on moral failings to the next generation, that's the key word, and that's what the Torah wants to underscore. These two essential ingredients of the modern Adam, that number one, he has the instinct and capacity to perceive the metaphysical and the divine, and that he has the free will to choose wisely between good and evil, are the two things that Hashem wanted us to know about ourselves at the very beginning of the Torah. When looking out upon society today, it would seem that a society that rejects Torah's narrative of Adam and Eve will also tend to reject both premises. Our job as the Jewish people is to restore that narrative back to the communal conversation, whether it be in our homes, on social media, or in the town square. By doing so, by reminding man that we are created in God's tselem and in God's demut, we hope we can repair all the injuries of this wounded world and see the ultimate redemption, dear friends. Here's wishing you a Shabbat Shalom after a beautiful Chag, after a beautiful Yontif. Shabbat Shalom.